everyone, how's it going? Today we are playing a 10-in fast advanced deck versus Wizard. Keep my opening hand. Lots of ice, some money. Draw into a double DNA tracker. This should be pretty sweet. Lots of runners have no way of dealing with DNA tracker early on in the game, so having them on your centrals is a big boon. My opponent plays Employee Strike, threatening to play the passive game early on, not having to run. So I erase it with scoring a clone retirement. So Jinteki doesn't have really a lot of good currents to use against someone who spams Employee Strike. This is one of the small problems of playing ice-based Jinteki deck. One way to solve it is by playing Egg Infusion. With Egg Infusion, you can threaten either the very strong ID ability or Caprice Nisei. If they don't have Rumor Mill, they can't have Rumor Mill and Employee Strike up at the same time. With Tenon, you can't really do that, but what you can do is to play Clone Retirement, which acts as your 7th point, your 1-pointer, and also allows you to clear currents when needed. So seems pretty effective here, as I'm able to start getting some advancements going on my DNA tracker on HQ. So what you really want to do is to use it as a Trick of Light battery. As you can see, I can score the Philotic Entanglement in my hand right now, but scoring it doesn't really do much for me, for my game right now, and I do have an IPO that I can play. Seems like a no-brainer that I should be playing my IPO instead of scoring this agenda in my hand, which is relatively safe, given that it's protected by a DNA tracker. So I go ahead to take credits, take cards, take IPO money. And at this point, my opponent still shows no sign of advancing their game in terms of being able to get past the DNA tracker. With the central sealed up pretty nicely, they're going to take a huge face check punishment to the face with a DNA tracker on R&D. And this is where I start to really get to ascertain what kind of wizard they're on. It's pretty obvious by this point. There are lots of resources in their hand. It kind of suggests that they are playing some sort of regular wizard. And lots of spicy cards in the bin, huh? Nerve Agent and Jargonu Mercs. Those were the net damage targets that came from my opponent's hand. Very interesting, very spicy reg wiz list. But most importantly, the DNA trackers suck them down from 6 credits to 0. This is a huge hit to the tempo, not to mention losing some of their spicy cards from the hand, meaning that they have to spend the next few clicks clicking for credits. So they might have gotten a Data Sucker counter here. They might have pushed my tempo back a bit because it makes it harder for me to play the restructure from my hand, but this hurts them even more as they're forced to click for credits for the rest of their turn. Meanwhile, I'm playing IPO here and I get to play restructure next turn. So my economy is looking pretty good. I can still res the DNA tracker on HQ if need be, especially if they decide to go really aggressive here. But instead, they're going to zoom in on R&D with a Parasite on DNA tracker, suggesting to me that they are interested in big medium digging my R&D. So to defend against that, I think putting Colossus on R&D is the right choice here, and advancing it is a pretty safe move right now. Reason being, if my opponent is really on Reg Wiz, their Sentry Breaker is Mimic. Mimic and Data Sucker gets past a Strength 4 Sentry. Since they have 1 Sucker counter, I'd like the Sentry to be Strength 5, hence the extra advancement on Colossus. I do not want the DNA tracker to go down anytime soon, so I do want to protect this DNA tracker that has a Parasite on it for as long as possible. My opponent starts sniffing around HQ as well, and this is where I deliver the bad news. They're going to take another 3 net damage and 6 credit penalty to the face. They can't do much about it, but it does trigger an I've had worse, and it also trashes an Employee Strike and a Desperado. Some really valuable hits there, but my opponent gets a valuable hit in return by sniping the 1 in 3 Philotic Entanglement from my hand. So we're in a very interesting juncture where I can't really play the Celeb Gift from my hand due to the low hand size I have, and drawing cards or taking credits isn't that good, so I decided to purge Forest Counters instead. Being on this credit level is kind of dangerous because all my opponent needs to do theoretically is to run Archives a few times. All it is an Ice Wall protecting Archives. They have a Paperclip in the bin, they can easily get through. And this is really bad news for me. I need to make sure that my server is I can easily defend R&D before they get enough sucker counters to remove the DNA tracker with Parasite on R&D. That DNA tracker is the only thing that is stopping them from complete domination with medium digs. This deck doesn't really run Cyberdeck's Virus Suite, even though it's a fast advanced deck, so I am actually very concerned about losing the DNA tracker on R&D. So I draw all my fast advanced tools, which makes it now a very good time to show it off to my opponent, showing them that the win is in R&D, not in HQ. So this is a very good time to doubly fortify my R&D with a Christian Grid on R&D, just in case they have a medium on the Street Peddler. This DNA tracker on R&D is now at 3 strength, so a York on Peddler is also another way they can get through, but they choose not to. Instead, they're going to solidify their economy, giving me more time to place advancements and put that Colossus up to strength 6, now on R&D. And given that, the DNA tracker was in really dangerous range, I think there are 5 virus counters total between the R&D Ice, the R&D Parasite and the Data Sucker. I was forced to purge again. So taking the tempo to purge is actually quite a loss for me. But now that I have all 3 centrals pretty much patched up, I'm feeling pretty good about my position right now. And here my opponent makes a huge mistake. They play 2 injects from their hand, dropping all the way to 0 cards in the deck. And in doing so, milling both their Yorks into the bin. So I think at this point my opponent starts regretting their life decisions, and this is something that is a very good learning point for most of us Netrunners. We'll talk about that a bit more as you see here, I start deciding to fast advance the medical breakthrough from my hand. You don't really want to do this because it costs 2 Trick of Lights, but since I drew all 3 Trick of Lights, and since I haven't used any Jacksons yet, and since my opponent played the last Employee Strike from their hand, I think it's worth it to get rid of the strike and put myself on 3 points by scoring this med breakthrough. The biggest problem with this is not the fact that I expended 2 of my 3 fast advanced tools. The biggest problem is that it removed 2 advancement counters from the Archives Ice. I was forced to use the Archives Ice because it's better than losing counters from Colossus. But what this means is that now my opponent can much more cheaply get through Archives and farm Data Sucker tokens. That Ice Wall is now strength 2 instead of strength 4, which means that it only costs them 1 credit get through each time. And that's negated by the Desperado gain, and they are getting suckers for doing so. So this is really bad for me. So I wouldn't say this was a mistake, it was just really unfortunate that I wasn't able to fortify Archives as much as I would have liked. Another mid-range Ice on Archives would have been really nice, but I didn't really draw it. All I drew were the 2 Ice on Polarizing Ends of Spectrum. The Quandary, which is more or less free for my opponent to waltz through, and the big bulky Chiashi, which is too expensive to res. That being said, given that both of the Yorks are now in the bin, perhaps installing a Quandary was the right move. This was something I didn't really consider, but it's a really good point. I should have installed Quandary on Archives given that they had expended both their Yorks in the bin. So you will see me check their bin later and we'll find out what exactly happened. But first, they decide to run R&D attempting to destroy my DNA tracker with a combination of 5 virus counters on Sucker, Parasite, and an Ice Carver. But they failed to do so because they didn't see the Colossus coming, which sucked some Data Sucker counters from them, thereby rendering them unable to break the inner DNA tracker. So they lost tempo there, but I also lost tempo by raising the Colossus. What I did here was to show up Archives with a mid-range Ice, as I mentioned earlier. This is way more economical than triple advancing the Ice Wall on Archives because that is very click intensive. Wouldn't have gotten me anywhere fast. So you notice that I wanted to put the Colossus at strength 5 because this is the correct amount of strength to stop them from farming their sucker counters. Since they have since they have Ice Cover, I need the strength sentry to be strength 5. So yep, this way they are not getting their sucker counters while they run Archives. However, it's still worth it for them to run Archives just to deny me the Tenin ability. At this point, Tenin's ability starts becoming really frustrating for my opponent to deal with, and something that they must deactivate every turn, otherwise R&D becomes increasingly impenetrable. However, they still have one fancy trick up their sleeves. They used Street Peddler to install Net Ready Ice, sniping 2 cards from their hand, one of which is a medium that they need. Let's look at the heap. Looking at the third row, we can see both of the Yorks that my opponent runs in the deck have been milled by the injects. The thing that happened with my opponent was that both of the Street Peddlers that they had in the mid to late game had deja vus on them. So you can see that in the fourth row where both peddlers were preceded by deja vus. And that was very unfortunate. It meant that they couldn't use deja vu to retrieve York from the bin and then play it onto their rig. That being said, my opponent could have easily avoided this tragic situation if they knew what they were searching for when they played the injects. Instead of playing if they knew they were searching for Yorks, they shouldn't have played the injects, which would mill the Yorks. Instead, they should have clicked for cards the hard way, even though it is more time consuming. If they knew what they were searching for, it makes a lot of sense just to draw the Yorks normally and then play them from hand, especially if they knew that both of their deja vus ended up getting stuck on street peddlers. So I think one very important takeaway is to know what you are know what you're doing with every click. Why are you playing injects? Why are you drawing cards from your deck? Is there a particular card you're searching for? And if there is there a more efficient way to go about doing so? Or as is the case in this game, are you using a risky method in the inject that ends up not getting you the card that you were originally searching for? So it's very important to play the game with a sense of direction and purpose to achieve whatever goals that you're trying to get. In this case, my opponent was now breaker locked. They could not get past code gates. All I needed to do from this point on was to solidify the code gates that were protecting each server. On R&D, this meant that I needed to preserve the DNA tracker that was being parasited down, and to do that, all I had to do was to keep advancing the Colossus on R&D and purge from time to time to make sure that the DNA tracker never went down. From my opponent's board state, this was too much to deal with, and hence they conceded. I think one interesting thing to discuss here is that even if my opponent found their York, they would have a pretty hard time dealing with my deck. The Reg Wiz Breaker Suite is known for being super efficient in terms of the number of credits needed to break a lot of ice. Due to York being 0 to break and Mimic being 1 to break for most sentries, it ends up being a very efficient rig compared to most others that you get in the Criminal or Shaper faction. However, there comes with a caveat. This only holds true if the corp deck is made up of mostly 5 strength or lower ice. This is not the case for the Tenin deck, which runs bulky Jinteki ice such as Chiashi and DNA Tracker, along with Wayland advanceable ice in the form of Colossus. This gives this Tenin deck a critical mass of strength 6 or more ice, which I can then use to seal up every single server. You notice at the end game, every single server had at least one 6 or more strength ice on it. To Colossus on Archives and R&D, and then DNA Tracker on R&D and then HQ. Even if my opponent found their York, they would be starved of data sucker counters, especially since they only managed to find one data sucker throughout the entire game. To gain data sucker counters, they would have to make successful runs, unlike Criminals or Shapers, who are able to power their breakers, pump their strength by paying credits. Therefore, while Shapers and Criminals can click for credits to amass enough credits to make runs, or rather this Reg Wiz build cannot do that. The only way they can get data sucker counters is to run the centrals, but to run the centrals, they need the data sucker counters in the first place. So with enough high strength ice, I was able to lock my opponent in a catch-22 situation, where running was impossible. The only way they were able to get data sucker counters was to eat ice subroutines to the face, which was possible because most of my ice weren't end the run. However, they had very punishing subroutines. Either they would be losing a lot of credits to DNA Tracker, or they would be losing their entire rig to Colossus, which is unproductive. So this is the strength of the Tenin Ice Suite, in that the runner, or rather Anarch runners, are not able to get through with the rig very easily, and they can't simply click through the ice unlike you would HB decks. This is why HB decks falter so hard against Reg Wiz decks, because their ice is not in the 6+ strength range and they are clickable anyway, so the runner always has an out against these ice. It's a very interesting dynamic, and this is actually what makes the game interesting. In this case, I think the Tenin Ice does win out, especially if you manage to draw your DNA Trackers and Colossus in quick succession as I did. If you want to try a Tenin list for yourself, I suggest you build one from scratch. Given what you've seen in this video so far, you have already seen all the fundamentals, and you know what the Ice Suite is supposed to look like, and you know what kind of economy is powering it. It shouldn't be too difficult to build one up yourself. I'm not going to post my list in the description. Do give the deck building a shot yourself. In the meantime, as always, thanks for watching and happy net running. I'll see you next time.